we're back. All right, we'll talk about PPE and protective clothing ensembles. So, just like anything in the fire service, when we face a potential hazard, we want to wear PPE. You can't just wear general PPE though. You need to try to wear PPE that's specific to whatever problem we're responding to or addressing. So again, there's some NFPA standards. They're developed by several agencies. NFPA 1991, 94, and 1951. So this minimum level against vapor and splash protection, that'll be important, not necessarily that standard, but to wrap your mind around those two terms. Vapor protection and splash protection, okay? And particulate or solid. NFPA 1994 has different classes of ensembles, and then they have requirements for entry into a chemical, biological, or radiological or nuclear. 71 is optional protection from CBRN. 1851 is structural gear. What's structural gear designed for? Structural firefighting. Okay. Can we use it for hazmat? Yeah, in some cases. And actually, most cases, it'll provide some level of protection, better than nothing at all, but it's not intended or designed. 1992 is the Design Performance Certification Documentation for Liquid Splash. 1999 is blood and body fluids. 1975 is on work uniforms, station uniforms. And then 1982 is for pass systems. That makes, I mean, a pass system, everybody should know, is integrated into your impact, right? 20 years ago, that wasn't the case. It was a separate standalone box you had to remember to turn on. 2112, flash fire protective garments. 2113 is the selection, care, and use, and then protective gloves, which are Andersen. Reflective material from ANSI, eye protections from ANSI, and industrial components. And all that stuff carries over to transfer. OSHA 1910.120 talks about HazWhopper, and it develops into 5 distinct groups. PPE for eyes, face, head, and extremities. So really, and we've talked about this, but OSHA and HazWhopper talks about hazardous waste operations, not necessarily hazardous materials response. There's a subsection within 1910.120, subsection Q, if you care to look it up. It is specific to HazMat operations for state and local authorities. And then 1910.156 is PPE for industrial fire brigades. So, what's the big thing about bunker gear? What does it not give us? Yeah, vapor protection.
Doesn't it make
But it has a vapor barrier. Right, doesn't it? 3 layers.
Yeah, it's still not safe.
Doesn't it trap it in there?
Okay, it's designed for steam protection.
Doesn't it like trap vapors within the thing close to your body? Like it gets in there and it gets stuck.
Between the outer and inner layer. It works on the premise of layering, essentially, protecting you from the heat and outside contaminants. And again, what are your probably biggest areas for potential contamination? Yeah, anywhere the material comes together. Now, can we use this? What instances would we use this in? What for? What priorities?
Life safety.
Yeah, life safety. Can we use it for incident stabilization? We could in a defensive posture, maybe, if we're gonna allow something to run off or something to continue to leak, and we're gonna contain the leak, we can do that away from the hazard, okay? The big thing is though that there's not adequate vapor protection, okay? So, let me throw a curveball at you, all right? What, class 3, does anybody know what a class 3 is off the top of their head? What hazard it is? Is it an explosive, radiological?
It's flammable liquids.
Flammable liquids, okay? Gasoline is a class 3, right? So if we have an overturned gasoline tanker, has a class 3 placard on it, it's leaking gasoline, what is its highest hazard? Flammability. But what is it before it's flammable? Yeah, it's toxic, and there's vapors. So do we wear a splash protective suit, or do we wear bunker gear?
You should wear a splash protective suit, but you wear bunker gear.
To me, the answer is, it depends. If it's the middle of December, how is that gonna be different, and it's at night, how's that gonna be different in the middle of the day on July 4th? You're gonna have less vapor production, probably less possibility for fire, especially if we've controlled all of the ignition sources. So in the middle of December, would we be okay in a splash protective suit? Yeah, we'd probably actually be better off. Because if we get fuel on this, what are we gonna have to do with it?
You can't decontaminate it before you can use it.
Decontaminate. And can we just wash it in the bunker washer and be okay? Probably not. It's probably gone. Probably has to be disposed of. So if you're unlikely to contact the product, your hazards are identified, it's not toxic to skin, if there's fire or a chance of fire, and if structural PPE is all that's available, and with anything, the IC has the ultimate authority. So they've worked on some of this CBRN bunker gear. It continues, bunker gear obviously continues to make advances. They worked on, so if you notice the gloves right here, there's a magnetic cuff. So that cuff on the coat essentially integrates with your glove to create a vapor barrier against your wrists. The boots were like at least in earlier versions or early versions, had like a chemical splash protective suit foot in it or a plastic footy in it. What's the problem with that though? And if that is throughout the entire suit? Yeah, right? Well, how often do we use this gear on a CBRN incident? Probably once in a career opportunity if you're gonna use it for a rescue. But where do we use it a lot? Structure fires, normal day-to-day operations. So the cost was unrealistic, and then really user comfort. It was almost like being in a Ziploc bag with bunker gear around the outside. But they'll continue to make advances in that and with different fabrics and materials. There's a flexible gasket where the coat seals around the face piece. Heat-resistant magnets. The other place, and not so much related to HazMat, although it's taking care of a HazMat problem, but if you're all into like gizmos and gadgets, like me, they, at one point, so as a new firefighter, I got all these cool gizmos and gadgets, and I would wear like this leather truck belt for like a year, and then I'd be like, I want to try this belt, so I'd sell it. So they called me Andersen.com for a while. So if you're looking for anything, let me know, and I'll tell you if I have anything in stock. That being said, there's a place called thefirestore.com. You guys probably know about it. They sell a lot of fire equipment. The new thing is hoods, and you can get a hood for about $30-40, or you can get a hood for about $100. And the new hoods are particulate hoods that are designed and meant to not allow the cancer-causing particulates from a structure fire to be absorbed into the skin as readily. It's better and more protection. And it's essentially like having a hood that's made of a vapor barrier with cloth covering on either side of it. So it's hotter and it's a little more cumbersome to operate in, but they'll continue advancements like that, and I don't think it'd be unrealistic as that will continue to be developed and then someday be the norm of what we're wearing for a living. Proximity suits, where do we see proximity suits? What type of?
Airports?
Yeah, airport firefighting. High temperature protective clothing, short-term, high temperature exposure. So what are the limitations of using that?
You know, you don't dissipate any body heat, you get pretty hot on the inside pretty
Yeah.
fast.
It causes the user, there's risks to the user using that long term.
You can underestimate the fire retardants.
And you can absolutely underestimate the fire. Have we gotten to a place, I'm sure you talked about this in your academy, but has our gear almost become too good? In some ways, it's allowing us to go further and deeper without recognizing true conditions. So chemical protective clothing, it's called CPC, okay? Shield hazards that may be at a hazmat incident. So each material protects but has limitations, and we'll talk about that. Has to be fitted properly, worn correctly, impermeable to moisture, and decontaminated before storage and disposal. What do you guys think about being decontaminated before storage and disposal? We'll talk about that. We'll talk about permeation later in this chapter, and that we'll tie that into storage and/or disposal. So liquid splash protective suit, does it protect against vapors? It's just what it says, liquid splash. Now here's where confusion occurs, okay? So we have an encapsulated suit, and then we have a non-encapsulated suit. So what does a non-encapsulated suit look like, essentially? A pair of work coveralls. The material, though, is designed for chemical protective clothing. So it's, for lack of a better term, something you would think of as like a body bag type of material. Okay. So an encapsulated suit, the benefit to an encapsulated suit is that it covers your SCBA. So in the non-encapsulated suit, your SCBA goes over the coveralls, so to speak. In an encapsulated suit, you put your air pack on your normal work uniform, then you put the chemical protective clothing on. There's like a big hump behind you that protects the air pack, okay? In the back of that suit, horrible at drawing, but I'm gonna give it a shot. Everybody good with all the parts per million stuff, and can I erase all that? Okay. So here's our happy hazmat guy. Got a little bit of hair. Told you I'm no artist. I don't know where I'm going with this, but this is his body, this is his hands. Something like that. See the resemblance? All right, so if this is the back of our person, and they're in a chemical suit, there's like two little holes, but you can't see them, they're covered by a flap of the suit, and that's to protect that. Close up, all that is a big hole in the suit. Now why would we want or have that hole in the suit, in an encapsulated suit?
Air cover device or something.
Maybe.
It's just a one-way flat type thing?
Well, so it's a hole, and this essentially just hangs over it. So it's to protect the hole from any liquid splash going in that hole in the back.
Well, you can burn air out that way.
Yeah, and that's all it's for. So if we're in an air pack, in an encapsulated suit, what happens when we used an open circuit SCBA? So what happens when we exhale?
Yeah, if we don't have a way to get rid of that pressure, our suit's gonna expand, okay? This is kind of a poor picture of an encapsulated suit over here to the left, because it has, I don't think it's actually an encapsulated suit. Because an encapsulated suit has a full front piece, like plastic window. It looks like a level A, and we'll talk about the different levels here. So my point behind this is vapor can pass in or out of this at will. It's simply meant for an equal pressure inside and out. Now, the misconception becomes, well, because this is a fully encapsulated suit, that it provides some level of protection against vapor. That is absolutely not true. And in fact, I've been on an incident where we've caught ourselves and we've operated this way. Because how much do you think this suit is versus a suit that has vapor protection? Yeah, this suit is 60, 70 bucks. A cheap level A is about $800-900 bucks. So command's at the top, and what are they thinking? That's probably isn't a big deal. I think we can get away with this with encapsulated Bs. Okay? So it's important to understand the difference between the two. So a level B can look like this, but it all depends on the valving in the back. So this is vapor protective clothing, and the difference is in this hole, there's a flap in there. It's like a little rubber diaphragm. So it has the hole, and then it has the rubber diaphragm on this side, so it won't allow anything in, but as pressure overcomes the outside pressure, it will essentially burp out pressure from inside the suit. Okay? So it has to have that valving to be a vapor protective suit. The problem with a vapor protective suit, it's the greatest level of protection that you can have, but you can't really see very well. It's hard to move, and it's even harder to communicate. Heat stress becomes a pretty big deal. So doing a site survey, rescue. Now there's been debates back and forth about doing level A rescues. What do you guys think about using chemical protective clothing for a rescue? Make it difficult, it's time consuming, you're not going to get into it right away, and if you have to be in such a great level of protection, what's the viability of that patient? Probably not very good. To my knowledge, there hasn't been any rescues done in chemical protective clothing that I'm aware of. I'm sure somewhere out there that could be argued, but for the most part, I think any rescue that has occurred is probably through bunker gear. You gotta go through decon, and then evacuation or getting out of the suit is not as simple or easy process. So you have to have policies, procedures, guidelines. But what's the thing about policies, procedures, and guidelines? We can have them, and that's great, but what do we also need to do? We have to implement them, people have to know them, and we have to actually follow them. Okay? So we try to identify the hazard. Medical monitoring, and what that speaks to is we don't want to put anybody into a suit that isn't medically capable to operate in a suit. If they have some medical condition going on, we certainly don't want to put them in a suit. But the bigger deal to that, what should we know about the chemical that we're dealing with specifically? Its health effects. How is that important, or why is that important to us as responders?
Well, it's gonna give you the level of protection that you need to have.
Yeah. So if I, let's say hydrogen cyanide, for example, we've talked a little bit about that. That has effects that are similar to a heart-related injury or illness. So if I have an elevated pulse, or my blood pressure is off from a baseline, then that might signal that I have been either exposed or contaminated by the chemical. Okay? So when we do medical monitoring before we get in the suit and after we get in the suit. The whole point of doing it before is creating a baseline, and then we do it afterwards to see if that baseline has changed. And that could lend itself to indicating either exposure or contamination. Okay. Selection, care, testing, and maintenance. And then we actually have to
trained in the equipment and know how to use it, okay? The selection, care, testing, and maintenance, certainly care and maintenance. The testing is a big deal, and think of it like fire hose, okay? We don't want to show up to an incident and charge our fire hose and water goes everywhere except out the nozzle. That'd be a bad deal, right? Same thing with chemical protective clothing. We want to make sure that it can hold pressure and that it's not going to allow a chemical or vapor in it. So it has to be acceptance tested when we receive it, and then it has to be tested once a year. It's pressurized, and it can only lose so much of a variation in pressure before it's taken out of service. All right, so 3 main processes can reduce the effectiveness of chemical protective clothing. So we have a chemical spill, okay? We get chemical, this is our actual suit material, all right? So think of that like a sponge. So if I take a clean sponge, and I'm gonna go do the dishes, put a little bit of Dawn dish soap on there. What else, what do I do then to do the dishes? Put a little bit of water. What happens to the sponge? Absorbs the soap, becomes kind of a mixture, and right, starts to, you can use it to wash, okay? So you can't see it with the naked eye, but on a molecular level, think of the suit material like a sponge. So once I've put that Dawn into the sponge, when I'm done doing the dishes, I just rinse the sponge and get all the Dawn out, right? No, you're not gonna get it all out. How long would you stand there at the sink with a sponge trying to get all the soap out? Forever, it's near impossible. You just don't try to do it, because next time you go to use it, there's still a little bit of soap in there. That's not a big deal. Is that a big deal though in chemical protective clothing? If we think of that like a sponge, where does that become an issue? When it comes through to the other side. Now that can either happen at the incident, or it can happen later if we choose to hang on to that suit. So my point is, if we use that suit in an incident, can we decon that suit? No, not completely. Will that chemical stop, or will that suit stop a chemical from going through the suit completely? No, it's not impermeable forever, okay? What will happen is the suit will degrade, all right? And it will reduce the effectiveness if the chemical is on it. And every suit has a permeation rate. So the manufacturer gives you a guide, gives you a permeation rate. And the most you can get is 8 hours. So the manufacturer will say, the longest you can be in this suit and it will be effective is 8 hours. So essentially what they're telling you in their own literature is after 8 hours, I can't guarantee whether or not the chemical is going to move from the outside of the suit to the inside of the suit. So now imagine that you've used a suit on an incident. Let's say it's some sort of a corrosive material. Is a corrosive material pleasant or unpleasant on the skin?
Unpleasant.
Very unpleasant, okay? So let's say we've gone through a decon, we've washed most of that out, and we say, you know what, we don't want to use this suit operationally, but we washed it off, we're good to use it as a training suit. So what happens 6 months later when it's been in storage and some schmo gets in the suit? What happens in the suit? Because it's like a big body bag that doesn't breathe. Start to sweat, okay? And what happens on your skin now? Now you're having chemical signs and symptoms of an exposure in a suit that you chose to turn into a training suit. So for us, anytime we use a suit operationally, it goes in the trash. Goes away as chemical waste, we don't reuse it at all. The only suits we use as training suits are those that fail the pressure testing. So there's degradation and then penetration. Certainly it shows it here with the zipper, but if you cut your suit, is that bad? Yeah, that would be the penetration. Okay.
So 3 labels, all require decon before leaving a contaminated area. Most suits are disposable. I will say, however, there's Trelleborg suits that are European suits. The European standards are way higher than US standards. And you can send them a suit after it's been used, and they will decon it further, and they will certify it as a good suit. How they do that or what the process is, I'm not sure, but there is a process or opportunity to do that. So who dictates or who has say in NFPA standards? Do you guys know who makes up the boards of NFPA standards? So it's a whole gamut of different people, but specific to this, not only is it users or HazMat people, but it's also manufacturers. So who has some pull or has a stake in the claim as a manufacturer of whether or not or what the standard is for suit testing? Manufacturer, right? Because if NFPA makes it a higher standard, like let's say we went to the European standard, is that going to have a cost effect on the manufacturer?
Sure, so it increases cost of production.
Yeah, absolutely, right? So there's a cost associated with that, okay? I think it just helps to put that into perspective of the standards and really where they come from and what they're telling us. It's no different than in the bunker gear standard, hose standard. There's manufacturers that are involved in those different NFPA committees or subgroups. Body armor is designed to protect against ballistic threats. Obviously, if you get shot, if you have body armor, you probably don't want to reuse it. And the other thing about body armor, it's not going to protect you completely. It's not like you can take the body armor off and you're fine. Does that make sense? There's going to be generally over penetration, and it's going to hurt. Okay? We had an officer get shot in Loveland, and the vest stopped the shotgun blast, but the surgeon could essentially put his fist into the hole that it created from the overpressure in his chest. He lived, thankfully, but it's still going to cause damage on the other side. Bomb disposal suit certainly can impair dexterity, range of motion, and again, this isn't like, hey, you can live through an explosion. You'll probably live, but you may not have like your hands and feet or stuff like that. There's still some level of risk operating in this gear, just like there is in chemical protective clothing. So the 4 different levels, and this is from an EPA, and generally these are the levels that are associated with chemical protective clothing. You'll hear them called level A, B, C, or you don't really talk about level D, but we'll talk about what that is in a minute. So level A is vapor protection. That's the highest level of protection. So it's either, it could be an unidentified substance or threat, but generally it's known there's a high level of hazard. And there's suspected skin toxicity or it's a carcinogen. And we're worried about our respiratory, and we're worried about skin absorption. Certainly in confined or poorly ventilated areas. Level B is used in specific situations. It's splash protective with positive pressure respiratory protection. Okay. High respiratory but less skin protection. Level C is essentially a level B. It's a splash protective suit. The respiratory component is different. So you have an APR or a powered APR in level C. Okay. We've talked about the criteria for APR and all that. Level D is essentially your work uniform. It says no hazards, but we talked about using bunker gear falls into level D, and we talked about using bunker gear in specific situations for life safety. Talked through that as we go through this.
regulations, the chemical, biological, or radiological hazard there is, what's the physical environment. There's a lot of different designs in chemical protective clothing. We talked about the encapsulated versus the non-encapsulated. Permeation, degradation, and penetration, what those mean to the chemical. Most of the time for us, it's ease of decontamination and it's disposable. We rarely, at least in the American Fire Service, use a reusable suit. And I mean, no well, I shouldn't say no, but most manufacturers aren't going to market their suits as reusable, right? If they want more money, what are they going to tell you? I need another suit. But that should also speak to I mean, really, as a society, we're kind of a throwaway society. And we kind of make things with the intent that they're going to last for a specific use or purpose and then get thrown away. Chemical protective clothing is no different. It does have to be disposed of, however, as chemical waste. It shouldn't just be thrown in the dumpster with normal everyday trash. And then interoperability with other equipment, specifically communications. Most HazMat teams have specific communication equipment they can use inside of suits. Our mission certainly dictates what level of PPE, or not what level, but dictates the PPE. Law enforcement has a much different mission, right? So we talk about it often in a SWAT environment. What's the difference in a SWAT environment versus a fire service environment?
They're far more likely to get shot
I
at.
need bulletproof vest.
Yeah, their PPE is different and their hazard they're encountering is different. They're also not dealing with the hazard in general. They are doing a very specific mission to probably clear a house, something like that. And so their exposure is generally very short. It's a short window, and they're generally not exposed to the chemical like we might be in the fire service for rescue or for mitigation. Same thing with EMS. MOP gear, mission-oriented protective posture is a military thing. And it comes out from the Joint Service Lightweight Integrated Suite Technology, or JS list. And there's different levels of MOP protective gear. You can have just the suit, integrates a gas mask and a hood, if there's gloves, and then booties, the entire ensemble. There's several safety concerns for us. Heat-related injury or illness certainly goes up. There's no insulation from the cold, although do we generally get cold in chemical protective suits? Not usually, because you're sweating and it's not allowing that body heat transfer. So you're generally hot, but what's the problem like right now if we were outside doing a hazmat incident?
Sweat and then you get cold.
Yeah, you sweat, and once you get out of the suit, now there's a problem and you become hypothermic. You can even become hypothermic in normal, nice temperature kind of days, if there's high enough wind, stuff like that. So it's concerns essentially for responders that are in chemical protective clothing. We talked about the medical monitoring piece. Most everybody in here has some level of medical training, I would assume, and so we'll skip over the heat-related stuff. It's a bad deal, though. Fluid consumption, air cooling, ice cooling, water cooling, and they talk about cooling vests. So a cooling vest is it's a vest that you can put ice packs in that you can wear under the suit. But there's also been some studies that have shown that kind of tricks your body, and so you're not really regulating your own heat in an appropriate way. And so almost like a child who kind of compensates, and then there's an immediate drop. Same thing with the cooling vests. So it's giving you this kind of false sense of it's not really cooling you, it's screwing up your normal regulatory system as a human. And then you compensate, then there's potential for injury. We used them for a while, and because of that, we took them away. Rest and rehab and work cycles, certainly fluid and physical fitness. We talked about the wind chill thing, certainly environmental conditions, rain, wind, snow, ice. Talked about the medical monitoring piece, why that's important. During our safety briefing in an overall HazMat incident, that will be specific items we'll talk about, the status of the incident, what the hazards are, but specific to this, we'll talk about PPE requirements and medical monitoring. You guys may be involved in that, but when do we do it, this type of a safety briefing, what level of an incident?
Usually technicians.
Yeah, usually a level 3 incident, maybe level 2, but certainly on a level 1 incident, you're not gonna do a safety briefing probably. It's, most of that stuff is just kinda given, or you kinda talk about it as a crew as you go along. Air management is certainly important. Why is it more important, or why do we give it more importance in HazMat? Well, not necessarily more importance, but we're certainly more intentional about our air management in a HazMat situation.
Gotta allow the time for the decon as well.
Yeah, we don't typically go through decon in a structure fire on air. When we come out of the building, we can unclip, and now we're in an okay environment to breathe the normal 21% oxygen, right? So, in the hazmat incident, you generally have to walk from the cold zone through the contamination reduction corridor into the hot zone, or the exclusion zone, do your work, then there's travel time back, and then there's time to go through decon. So you have to account for all of that. So there's huge fudge factors in air management. Most of the time, at least for us, we use 1 hour cylinders, and we save over half of that for safety. So you have like 10 minutes of travel time either way, including decon, and then you only get like 10 or 15 minutes of work time. I need hand signals if communications goes down. Okay. We're not gonna do the donning and doffing of chemical protective clothing for you guys. You guys won't operate in it, so there's no reason to do that. For the state and for the state JPRs, you can use either bunker gear or chemical protective clothing based on the AHJ, so you guys will use bunker gear. Okay? We talked about the inspection and storage and testing, and of course with the testing comes the management of records and keeping of records. Just like any PPE should be stored in a
Ready state.
ready state, dry state, away from sunlight. Preferably for chemical protective clothing is flat, but that's often difficult to do just based on storage. Okay. PPEs need to protect us.